The ocean is a vast environment, 1,200 million trillion litres of water, encompassing some of the most unusual environments on our planet. There's the deep sea, where the pressure is like having 50 jumbo jets balanced on your head, to the open ocean, where big food is so scarce that some sharks go for over a week between meals. But we're here at an environment much closer to home, the Rocky Shore, one of the most unusual environments that we can actually visit. My name's Jake, and this is Tara. We're both from the National Aquarium, and we're here to talk you through one of the most unusual environments right here at Ahuriri in Napier. And it is a very, very challenging environment indeed.
The Rocky Shore changes each day as the tide advances and retreats, giving new challenges to the animals that live here. Now there are 4 zones in the Rocky Shore. Low tide, which is covered by water most of the time. Mid tide, which is covered by water some of the time. High tide, which is covered by water only when the tide is fully in. And the splash zone, which is rarely covered by water and generally only splashed by waves.
So there's lots of unique challenges when you're living down here at the Rocky Shore. You have to make sure you don't get buffeted by any waves. And when you're the size of an adult's thumbnail, that can be a big challenge indeed. When that water goes out, the waves aren't a problem, but drying out is. Not only that, but if you can find a rock pool, you have to make sure that the water doesn't evaporate away or get too hot because of the sun. And one constant worry for the animals here is becoming someone else's dinner menu. Something to think about when you're trying to find food yourself. So without further ado, we'll start off at the splash zone, right at the top of our Rocky Shore.
Hang on, Jake. Before we get started, we need to cover some rules to help protect ourselves as well as the animals here.
In that case, we need a safety briefing. Suddenly, I feel safer already. What about you, Tara?
Absolutely.
Right, let's go over some of those safety rules.
Right, Jake. Well, our first rule is be careful on the rocks. They're covered with algae and they may move.
Well, we don't want it to turn into a bit of a rock and roll.
All right, second rule. Look out for the waves.
Yeah, we don't want the visit to turn into a washout, do we?
Okay, third rule. Wet your hands before touching the animals.
Yeah, I'm very glad Tara's touched on that one.
Okay, moving on. The next rule, make sure you lift these rocks and not roll them.
I hope the viewers at home picked up on that.
Oh, Jake. And the last, pick up any rubbish you may find.
Now there's a litter tip for you.
Oh, Jake.
And that is why I brought a hard hat along. Anyway, now we've covered the safety rules, so the animals and ourselves are safe, let's start exploring. So here we are at the splash zone. First stop, and a very challenging place to live it is too. You see, unlike all the other parts of Rocky Shore behind me, the splash zone is never completely covered by water. It only gets splashed by the incoming tides. So the animals who live here are at constant risk of drying out.
At least they don't have much competition for food, as so few ocean animals can live here. In fact, I don't see very many at all.
Well, surprisingly, the animals of the splash zone are actually all around us. It's just the ocean animals here are really, really small. These animals are periwinkles. They're tiny, just a few millimetres across, and they are one of the main animals of the splash zone. The problem for a periwinkle is being splashed off the rock by the oncoming waves, so they're masters at finding tiny holes and crevices to live in. There are 2 species here, the little blue periwinkles and the slightly larger brown periwinkles.
The waves also bring in lots of detritus. Detritus is basically the ocean's waste, like this power shell. This shell will eventually be broken up on the rocks. This golf ball sea sponge was washed away from the rock it was clinging to and was swept onto the rocky shore. It won't go to waste, as lots of animals at the rocky shore can eat it.
And hiding away in a crack or crevice is the common shore crab. A wee bit harder to find than the periwinkles, as it can scuttle away if you approach.
There is so much more to see here in the high tide zone. When the tide is in, this part of the rocky shore is fully covered with water.
And when the water retreats, it leaves lots of rock pools for animals to hide in, feed in, and rest in. So the danger here isn't running out of water, but it's being pushed off your rocks by the incoming tide. So the animals here have to cling really tightly onto their rocks. Here's one animal like that, just down here. It still might look like there's nothing here, but the more you look, the more you see. And lots of the animals that live on the rocky shore are really well camouflaged. The high tide zone is no different.
Sea anemones live in rock pools where their stinging tentacles can ensnare anyone drifting past. If they find themselves out of water, they can curl up into a ball so they don't dry out.
Now the rocky shore is teeming with sea snails, and the main one is this guy, the top shell. They look like the rocks they're resting on, as after all they don't want any hungry eyes to spot them. Just like a fish or a crab, these sea snails have gills. And on the underside of their body you can see the white of their shell. That's because their shell's made out of a type of calcium. The top shell likes to eat all the algae that grows on the rocks, just like these guys do, the limpets. Has anyone heard of the term stick like a limpet? As my goodness, limpets do stick. They're really hard to remove. Not only do they stick themselves onto rocks to protect themselves from the crashing waves, they do it to store the water inside their shell, so they don't run out of oxygen to breathe in between tides. And my goodness, they are very, very well hidden. The same goes for these guys, the chitons. They live a bit like a limpet, but unlike a limpet, they've got lots and lots of small shells that interlock together, just like a suit of armour. So the chiton shell can bend, so they can mould themselves around the rocks they live in. They can also move really, really slow. Think 28 metres in a day. That's pretty slow.
Barnacles are cousin to crabs. They start out life as plankton in the sea, but latch on to a surface when they are adults. They stick onto rocks, wharfs and jetties, even boats and whales.
So here we are at the mid-tide zone. Unlike the high tide and splash zone, there's lots of water here. But life still has its challenges. Here, there are lots more animals, which means a lot more competition for food.
Some of these animals swim and scuttle and move about more than life further up the beach.
Because there's so much water here, the animals in the mid-tide zone increasingly rely on it. Because of this, many of the animals can only live in the water. If the water goes, they go as well.
All these animals have slightly different ways of finding and catching food, and this limits competition.
Our next stop is at one of the largest rock pools at the rocky shore. It's a safe port of call for animals that need the water. Animals like these guys. But all's not as it seems. These crabs are half crabs. They're called half crabs because they don't quite have the same number of legs as normal crabs have. If you counted all the pincers, legs and paddles in a normal crab, you would get 10. On a half crab, you'd get 8, so they're actually more related to lobsters. Half crabs live in dense groups underneath the rocks. Pick one up and they'll all tumble out, but don't worry, they don't nip too hard. Very well camouflaged and very flat, crabs are the excellent rock dwellers around here. And it's just as well, it is an awful lot of them. Now this particular crab isn't born with a thick suit of armour. These are hermit crabs. They're born with a fleshy hook that they use to stick into vacant sea snail shells. Nothing goes to waste here. When anything dies on the rocky shore, it instantly becomes someone else's food or home. The problem is though, the crab gets bigger and the shell stays the same size, so there is a lot of competition for real estate around here. And they'll even try and get into a sea snail shell while the sea snail's still dying or being eaten. This one has commandeered the shell of a whelk, but it looks like it might need to upscale, perhaps something of a larger patio. If two crabs fight over a shell, the result can get quite nasty. It looks like a crab boxing match is going on. You might say that some get a bit crabby from time to time. And speaking of shells, this particular sea snail is responsible for lots of the holes in rocks and in shellfish shells. It's an oyster borer and uses its radula, basically a tongue full of teeth, to scrape into a surface. They often make the little depressions in the rocks where periwinkles and top shells like to hide. So they're very, very useful here. And lurking in some of the bigger rock pools, you'll find a fish. If you're used to fish being mighty kahawai or sharks in the open ocean, you'll be a bit disappointed of this one. These fish are triple fins, gobies and blennies. And the thing about them is that they like to stay really, really still, lying in wait for any food that might swim past, and they will then lunge out and grab them. Staying still also means they're well hidden away from predators. Imagine that you're flying or swimming above them and trying to spot them. Now these fish are really, really good at camouflaging, as you can see, but they're not the masters of deception here in the rock pools. Did you see the shrimp? It's right here. And few animals are harder to see than glass shrimps. Imagine being a predator trying to get a fix on them. They're called glass shrimps because within them you can see what they ate for dinner, you can see many of their organs. Basically, they haven't got anything to hide. They're masters of transparency, which means they can hide in pretty much any part of the rocky shore. They just blend right in.
Cushion starfish are the most common types of sea star found in the rocky shore. They can be seen in all sorts of colours as they need to camouflage in different places. Their skeleton is covered by a tough, leathery skin, which protects them when they squeeze between rocks. When a cushion star wants to eat something, they push their stomach outside of their body, engulfing their prey. They move using hundreds of tubed feet. Imagine controlling all these feet when you don't have a brain. Unlike most sea snails that eat algae, the whelk hunts other sea snails and also scavenge off of anything that has died. The whelk sniffs out its food using the tube-shaped proboscis, or nose, to sense its prey. The whelk glides along rocks using a strong muscle called a foot. And when a whelk moves, everything smaller gets out of its way.
Can often result in the most low-speed chase, a bit like those old kung fu or martial art movies where everything happens in slow motion. Well, that's the whelk's world.
we are at the low tide zone. This part of the Rocky Shore is almost always covered by water. But we are here during the few hours of the day where it is uncovered. And you can tell by all this live seaweed that is usually underwater.
So the animals who live here are used to lots of water, and for some, the retreating tide is a perfect opportunity to do some hunting. The low tide zone is right near the edge of the ocean, an ocean which can plunge down to 11,000 metres deep. So just like there's lots of moss that grows around the edges of ponds, the edges of the Rocky Shore's low tide zone are fringed with lots of seaweed. And you can tell where the seaweed lives based off its colour. Green algae can only live near the surface, but red algae and brown algae, just like this kelp, can live a lot deeper, but often washed up near the Rocky Shore. Kelp is the fastest growing producer in the world, growing as long as your arm in a single day. But it's not just kelp here. There are lots of smaller pieces of algae too, all covering the rocks, which means it really is a feast for a certain sea snail that calls the low tide zone its home.
Cat's eyes are the low tide version of the top shell we saw earlier. They grow larger and tend to like more water than top shells do. Like all snails, it produces enough slime to slither over a knife without injury. They're called cat's eyes because of the design of its operculum, which is their trap door that shuts at low tide, preventing them from drying out. Sea snail eggs are at risk of drying out too, so the snails often lay their eggs in the low tide zone. Snails can have thousands of babies, but only a few survive.
Now this character is a planaria, or flatworm, but it's not the sort of worm you'd expect to find in your garden. For a start, this worm can swim. It's sort of a graceful ballet as it searches for tiny pieces of food to eat. It needs the water, which means if that water starts drying out, it can slither across pieces of seaweed and rocks. A fascinating character. Primitive as it might be, it can still lose 10% of its heart and still regrow it again, which means scientists are very interested in them. Imagine if we could do that. Now there's another animal here that needs water too, but it's a bit more unlucky. This jellyfish is a member of one of the oldest groups of animals on the planet, stretching back over 500 million years.
This jellyfish was lucky and was swept out to sea. At least it won't end up like the golf ball sea sponge from earlier.
So while you were seeing all the animals down here at the Rocky Shore, you may have noticed something about them. How they are all often the colour of the rock or the seaweed that they live on. This is called camouflage, and camouflage is really important as it's one of the only ways you can avoid one of the top predators of the Rocky Shore. None other than the seagulls. Seagulls have got excellent eyesight, so looking like something rather tasteless, like a rock, or an old empty piece of shell, is one of the best ways of avoiding becoming the seagull's lunch. Now the Rocky Shore is a great place to visit, so before you head down here yourself, there's just a few safety pointers to go over again to make sure that the Rocky Shore stays pristine.
Now, you must remember to wet your hands before picking up any of these animals. And make sure you put rocks and animals back where you found them. And don't take anything home with you.
Except for litter, of course. There's way too much of that here already. So on behalf of Tara and myself, thank you very much for watching. We hope this has inspired you to learn more about the animals that live here. Sometimes you don't need to go to the plains of Africa or the deepest, darkest depths of the ocean to find unusual animals. Sometimes they're right here on your doorstep. Thank you very much for tuning in.